All right. Well, thanks for having me here today. I'm going to talk about the process of districting under the California Voting Rights Act and the process that we're going to be going through to get community engagement and to eventually lead to a process by which the board will draft and then ultimately adopt district boundaries for the purposes of elections. Now, to be clear, this line drawing process is not going to change anything that happens at the district level with regards to its own governance, except when it comes to the purpose of elections. When we're having elections, those election boundaries are going to be used, and then at the end of the day, board members are still going to represent the entire district. It's not going to change the job of the board. It's just going to change how these board members are selected. As a result of this process, each board member is going to be elected from his or her own district, not by an at-large election of the entire county. Districting is the process of drawing boundaries for the purpose of elections, and it's being essentially forced onto agencies that have at-large elections in California. And like I said, the districts are only going to have a purpose on election day. They're not going to have an operational purpose going forward beyond that. The process of redistricting, and oftentimes I'll use the term synonymously, the purpose of redistricting is adjusting those boundaries every 10 years. So when we do have district boundaries, it's going to be incumbent upon the board every 10 years after the U.S. Census comes out to look at the need potentially to adjust those boundaries based on population changes since the last time you drew districts. The term gerrymander is essentially the only thing most people know about redistricting. It's the thing you learn about in high school. And the gerrymander, technically, it was Governor Gary, so that people called the gerrymander. The gerrymander was based on a political cartoon of what looks like a salamander or dragon or something like that. And that was, hundreds of years ago. However, this is a Senate district drawn by the legislature in 2001, which is funny in that it looks a lot like the original gerrymander. But that's just to say that drawing districts that have weird shapes and drawing districts that potentially advantage one group or another still exists and happens. We will try to draw lines that respect communities of interest and deal with the criteria that we're going to lay forward here. And also the weird shaped lines aren't, and we'll talk about this later, but the weird shaped lines in of themselves are not a problem always, but they sometimes do draw questions. A second kind of level of understanding redistricting comes when you actually look at how partisan redistricting has worked to try to advantage one political party or another. In this example, you have 9 groups here, and if we draw the districts just like this in 3 rows, you would have one Democratic district, one Democratic advantage, and one Republican district. So theoretically, you'd have 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. However, somebody could draw it like this, and now you have 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. This is partisan redistricting. When we do local government redistricting, almost nobody ever talks about political party. In local government redistricting, we're talking about urban versus rural. We might be talking about different types of communities on one side or the other of some proverbial railroad tracks. It's less about parties and more about the district in and of itself and how it views itself. When we draw districts, we try to avoid this gerrymandering by following a set of traditional redistricting principles. The first is that all districts, each of the board seats from which we're going to be electing board members in the future, they should be equal size. This doesn't mean geography. That wouldn't be very easy necessarily. It doesn't mean voters. It doesn't mean even citizens. It means actual human beings that are in wherever they lay in the district on April 1st of every decennial census. So when we're talking equal size in this redistricting, we're going to be talking about residents in the district as of April 1st, 2010 census. So that is the be-all end-all of size. Contiguous means each district would be a whole piece, not skipping and jumping around, not having a district that is little pockets here and little pockets there and isn't connected. Maintaining communities of interest means that where there are in the district communities that identify with each other based on their workforce or the amenities that they share, the schools that they go to, however they view themselves, they're inland or they're coastal, that we're going to try to do the best we can to identify those communities of interest and draw them. There are some communities of interest that kind of rise above all others. And those are the ones covered by the Federal and California Voting Rights Act. This includes ethnic groups, nationalities, language. It can also include other things like religion or sexual orientation or other kinds of protected classes. One thing that comes up sometimes in redistricting is that male and gender can be a protected class, but gender is also so evenly disseminated around populations that I've never seen a redistricting case in which you could draw a female district and a male district. But we do draw districts looking at Latinos, Asians, African Americans, and other groups. I've worked in redistricting dealing with Armenians or Chaldeans and other communities like that. A little bit below in terms of rank, below these concerns about ethnicity and nationality, religion, and those protected classes are other things like senior citizen communities, coastal communities, people who are homeowners versus renters. I've done redistricting where we actually looked at the average number of years that people were living in their homes on one side of town versus how transient another part of town was. A fourth criteria that we're going to look at and use a lot has to do with following existing boundaries. And by that I mean we have cities that have identified themselves with exterior boundaries. And so you'll say this is Redwood City. And that boundary of Redwood City actually has meaning. It means something to the people who live there. It means something to the people who identify as living in Redwood City. And so as a way to draw boundaries, we will oftentimes rely on those existing governmental agencies. And the state redistricting process actually codified this for the purposes of drawing legislative and congressional districts, wherein the criteria is written out that they shall avoid crossing city and county lines. They need to draw districts that maintain, especially at the county level, districts that try not to split up counties. That doesn't mean they perfectly do that. It means that it's one of the criteria. They wouldn't, as an example, dilute the voting strength of the Latino population just to preserve the county line of El Dorado County. That would not make sense because it's a lower ranking criteria. But they might, if there was a coin flip between one choice or another, choose to really kind of use that county line or a city line as kind of the way to make that decision ultimately. Keeping districts compact is another criteria, but this is not compact like we think about it in lay people, just like small, but compact in terms of how you think of things being compact in science, let's say. In science, the most compact shape is a sphere. And so things that are spherical or square are more compact than things that are shaped like salamanders or eels. And so as a result of that, we're going to try to draw districts that might be hundreds of miles, hundreds of square miles, but in a way where they are as compact as possible given how, and we'll talk about this later, how dense or not dense a certain population is in parts of the district. So the California Voting Rights Act is the California interpretation of the federal law that actually expands on what's done federally with regards to voting rights. And it specifically goes at-large election systems. And an at-large election system is one in which everybody in a jurisdiction votes for maybe 2 board members one year and 3 board members the next year, but everybody votes and it's the top vote getters that win. You can think of a mayoral election as an at-large election, or a governor's race as an at-large election, whereas legislative district elections or county supervisor elections are all districted. What's interesting is the at-large election in California was actually a reform. It was actually something that was done in the progressive era in California to try to eliminate the ability of ward bosses, like you would see on the East Coast, to be able to control elections. So in California, when cities were being formed and local governments were being formed, they didn't want to create a scenario where, the South Sacramento ward boss could use patronage and money and favors to try to control the politics of South Sacramento. And so they created at-large election systems to weaken the ability for ward bosses to control elections in California. So it was a reform. But then you move forward 100 years, and that reform now has other kind of unintended consequences of diluting the voting strength of communities of interest, particularly ethnic communities. So the California Voting Rights Act says if you have racially polarized voting, if you have concentrations of ethnic groups that are having their vote diluted because of the at-large election system, then you have to convert to districts. It favors districts over at-large, whereas 100 years ago they were favoring at-large over districts. Racially polarized voting is a term that'll be thrown around a little bit. Essentially, racially polarized voting means that different ethnicities are voting for different candidates. They have different candidates of choice. It'll sometimes mean Latinos voting for Latinos and Asians voting for Asians, but it doesn't have to mean that. It can mean Latinos voting for a candidate, Gavin Newsom. It can mean Asians voting for a candidate, the Republican. It can mean Latinos voting for legalizing marijuana and Asians voting for a soda tax. I mean, anytime that those ethnicities are voting in ways that can be mathematically proven to be counter to each other, that's called racial polarization. Its functional meaning in federal law goes further. Its functional meaning in federal law means that it's vote differences where one side is always losing and the other side is always winning because of that polarization. California law and the implementation of the California Voting Rights Act and the state court cases that have happened so far have gone to that more layperson example. It doesn't require harm, it just requires presence. If racially polarized voting exists, then it's a California Voting Rights Act violation. It's not a federal Voting Rights Act violation until racially polarized voting infringes upon the rights of a minority group to elect a candidate of their choice, and it can be proven that one side is always winning and one side is always failing as a result of the polarization. So our polarization is based on that racial differences exist, whereas the federal law is that racial differences have outcomes that you can measure. And this has been shaped over the last 17 years of the California Voting Rights Act. Another big difference between California Voting Rights Act and the Federal Voting Rights Act is the Federal Voting Rights Act will swoop in and say that you cannot have an at-large election system if you have the racially polarized voting and you can create majority-minority, meaning more than 50% of one race districts. And you can prove that creation of the majority-minority districts would have a different outcome. Remember, the federal law is outcome-based. The California law liberalizes this. It doesn't even say majority-minority. It just says that you would be able to draw districts in which an ethnic population would be able to influence the outcome of an election. So federal law says you can prove that it'll change the outcome. Federal law says 50% majority-minority. State law says we don't care about the percentage. In some court cases it has been 18, 20, 27%. And it also says that we don't care about proving that you can change the outcome. It's just proving that one group could have a greater influence in the outcome. And influence isn't defined. The final thing is that what has been driving a lot of these cases, just like what has driven a lot of cases in ADA compliance and a lot of cases in Brown Act enforcement, has been attorneys. And this law essentially provides a guaranteed access to funds for attorneys that want to take on claims. Those claims have had extremely high costs where the agencies sought to fight these CVRA claims. And the high cost has been in the tens of millions around the state, and an unknown amount of actual attorney's fees just from the agencies that are trying to fight off the CVRA. Now the CVRA creates a path for agencies that want to follow a quick process to resolve the issue, and it caps the attorney's fees so that you're not having to potentially face millions of dollars in fines. So the conversion to districts happens in order to deal with concentrations of minority subgroups, to deal with racially polarized votings, and to allow for districted elections where the minority population could influence the elections. In San Mateo County Harbor District, we have 5 seats and we are in an at-large election system. So that's kind of point number 1. Are we under the CVRA? Yes, because we're in an at-large election system. The population of the entire district is just over 750,000 residents. That's based on the 2010 census. If we use that 2010 census and we break that population up into 5 equal districts, we're looking at about 144,000 people. Now, we're not going to be able to make each district exactly equal to one person. We do that in congressional redistricting, but we're not going to try to do that in districting of a special agency. We're going to allow a certain leeway. We're going to say these districts are all equal as long as the biggest one and the smallest one don't differ by 5%. And there is nationally around the country, I think Hawaii is the only state that doesn't draw congressional districts to one person. And the reason Hawaii doesn't draw congressional districts to one person is in order to do it, you'd have to hop islands. They would create what they called canoe districts. Canoe districts were when they tried to draw Hawaii districts equal to one person, and like one part of one island and one part of another island are now a district, and it makes no sense. So Hawaii does draw districts that are outside of that one person differential, but all around the rest of the country, all congressional districts are by one person. When we look at the district, I talked about governmental agencies. I think the most important kind of jump out at you one would be the cities. And there are a number of cities recognized by the censuses, and these are the populations of these cities based on the 2010 census. Daly City being the largest, followed by San Mateo, then Redwood City. And then there are, in addition to those actual cities that have city councils and mayors and so on, there are a number of what are called census-designated places, meaning like a neighborhood that might be part of an unincorporated area. And there are a number of those around the county that can be looked at when we're drawing districts to try not to split these if we don't have to. It's like an inherent community of interest, and this is essentially what it looks like. And you have a great high-quality map that the public can look at too. It looks very similar to this, obviously. But we have a population of cities, particularly those on the northeastern side of the county, along this 280 and 101 corridor, and we'll see there that that's actually where most of the population of the district lies. When we talk about the ethnic populations, and we're talking about the number of Latinos and Asians and African Americans or other subgroups, we're not talking about the raw number. What we use in redistricting to define the ethnicity of an area is its eligible voters. And for eligible voters, we look at citizen voting age population as defined by the census. Citizen voting age population means we're going to count the number of Latinos and Asians and African Americans all around the district based on if they're over 18 and they're citizens, because they could vote. They could register, they could vote, and if we're going to determine whether or not one area or another has greater voting power, enough voting power to influence an election, we have to not just look at the registered voters, because there could be other influences there as to why people are registering. We need to look at kind of the maximum number of people that could vote based on citizenship and age. When we look at that calculation, we do see, based on the census, and this is from the U.S. Census American Community Survey. I'll talk about the U.S. Census a lot for population equality. That's the 2010, April 1st, where people laid their heads on April 1st, 2010, all around the state, all around the country. The American Community Survey is averages that the census comes out with every year, and that will look at this estimate essentially of the ethnic population in these subsets. It's 1 out of every 6 households gets within the decade a American Community Survey form, which is the long form, and then every 10 years, obviously, everybody gets the short form. So based on that long form that goes to 1 out of every 6 Americans throughout every 10-year period, we have a population that's 25% Asian and 17% Latino, based on those who are over 18 and citizens. These, of course, and as you know the area, these aren't evenly distributed. These are, in a way, kind of pocketed throughout the county, and that's important when we talk about districting. There is a 3% African American population, but that's pretty small and not very, it's not pockets of African American population, and there isn't a reason to believe that African American population would even meet that, ability to influence an election kind of criteria. Now, if we did find a small community of African American population, we wouldn't drive a truck right through the middle of it and separate them into 2 different districts for no reason, but we haven't seen anything in the current data yet. When we look at the Asian CVAP, the Asian adult population, we do see certain pockets of Asian population in South San Francisco. Here, this is this is Redwood City as well, right? Right up there. Redwood City's down here. So San Mateo, Burlingame, and then down here in the southeastern portion of the district. When we look at Latino, we're looking at some of the same population now. We do see this huge area here, and that says that it's high Latino, but that is the shape of a census block group. It's supposed to be an area that's about 1,500 people. And this 1,500 people area is huge, so we don't know if this is, we would have to look more closely. This might only be 200-300 people. And if it's, if there's 60 Latinos, all of a sudden it pops out as being looking very heavily Latino. Where in an area over here is probably much more Latino, and we've worked in other redistricting in the county. This North Fair Oaks community is very high Latino. And then you also have a high Latino population up here that kind of looks as though it coexists with the higher Asian population. And so you have an Asian Latino population there combined. Oftentimes in redistricting, we will talk about ethnic communities and the need to preserve them as communities of interest. We might also talk about coalition communities, meaning ethnic communities or other groups that kind of vote with each other in parallel, in tandem. And so when we do look at some of these communities, we might say, well, this is a part of the district now. We've drawn a seat that is 18% Asian or 18% Latino and 33% Asian, and we see that 18 and 33%, when combined, does have the voting power to affect the outcome of an election. And there's data to suggest that they do vote in tandem. And it's not always that the ethnic communities are voting against each other's interests. Oftentimes they're voting aligned with each other's interests. And a lot of that can be socioeconomic. When we look at the density of the district, this is also important for when we actually see the lines, that they make sense to us. We have a very low density portion of the district, and then we have a very high density portion of the district. And so when we draw lines, I'm not going to predict what these lines are actually going to look like, but I will predict this. We're going to have 1 or 2 that are going to be massive. And we're going to have 2 or 3 that are going to be pretty small geographically because of this density issue. We have a high population density along this 280-101 corridor. And so as a result of that higher density and very low density in here, it doesn't even pick up. Because of this very high density, we're going to see most of the districts essentially falling within that area. The next steps that we have will be to engage with the public. We're doing that now by having this presentation being taped and made public, to people watching TV or people going to the website. We're going to have a number of meetings around the district in order for the public to come and engage if they want to. It's also important that the public knows that they can give any input. They don't have to be an experienced, GIS computer wizard to do anything. They can come in and talk about their community. They can point to a map. They can say that they want to have their neighborhood be preserved, or they want to say that they want their neighborhood to be drawn with the coastal district, or they can say what they believe is a community of interest in the in the redistricting process. And so anybody who comes forward and has input, all that input is going to be logged essentially, and it's going to be part of the final work product that develops the lines as we actually draw these. The process is going to take essentially there's going to be a before and after in this process. There's going to be a before we draw the draft lines, and there's going to be an after we draw the draft lines. We're going to have a couple of these community meetings first, just to be listening, and I'm not going to draw a line or have any prejudice about one plan or another or anything like that. Then, after we've taken community input, talked with board members and the public, we will draw a set of 2 or 3 or 4 draft plans for the remainder of the conversation, something that will allow people to see what a plan looks like and to react to it. So the before is entirely listening to the public, and then the after is listening to the public but with some pen on paper already and the ability for the public to react to actual potential plans that could be implemented by the board. Once we've had input on those public plans, there will be a single plan or multiple plans that will be agendized for a public meeting wherein the board will adopt a single plan, and that single plan will be the new boundaries to be used by the district until 2022 probably, or sometime after that, depending on what happens in the next census. It is possible that these boundaries we draw will be in place for 20 years or 30 years. If the county population isn't changing and there isn't a need to redraw the districts because they haven't fallen out of that 2.5% buffer, then you might not need to redraw districts in the immediate future. So that's the process we're doing. And I'm going to be around after each of these meetings to talk to anybody, but really the most important thing to do is if people do have comments, to do it in the public process and so it can be on the record. And that's it. Thank you.
A question.
Yeah.
I have missed it. The district has 5 commissioners, and they have to be within a 5%.
The smallest district, the lowest, yeah.
Yeah. Whoever said there should be 5 commissioners?
So this is interesting. There are 5 commissioners, and I'm not an expert in the statute. We do have attorneys here that might be able to point to where in the statute it is. It is a large geographic area to have only 5 people representing,
let's see. I can speak to that one,
no,
Steve.
okay.
And I'll just, without getting legal, I can say in answer to the question that the Harbor District is formed under the Harbors and Navigation Code of the government of the state of California. And the Harbors and Navigation Code is very clear about the process on what it takes to form a harbor district, how that election takes place, especially in that very first election. And that lays out that there should be 5 commissioners for a harbor district. And that's in Harbors and Navigation Code, section 6000.
All right. See, there you go.
Oh,
Sometimes you get an expert.
Yeah. And I also, just while I've got the camera, let me just say that if there are any comments from the general public on this, of course, you can go to our website, smharbor.com, and all our contact information, and this presentation will be uploaded to that website.
Any other questions?
I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
At the very beginning, when you said the districts are figured out by population, is that everybody in the district or is it just voting age people?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the creation of each district and how equal they're going to be, that is based on raw population. Kid, citizen, non-citizen, prisoner, somebody who's living in the district because they're staying the night at their grandma's house. Wherever people rest their head that night on April 1st of every decade, that's when the decennial census is taken, and that's what it's meant to represent. Now, that is the number that is used, and it's not perfect. There's problems in the census, but we treat it as if it's perfect, and that's the number we use when we draw equal districts. Now, there have been attempts to say, well, this equal population idea, it's kind of arcane, we don't really need it anymore. What makes more sense is we should only draw districts so each district has an equal number of voters. We do see some districts around the state where they're drawn equal by population, but then one district has 5,000 voters, the other side has 40,000 voters because of the composition of those districts. But it has gone to the Supreme Court even recently, in a case in Texas, where they tried to convert districting to by registered voter or by eligible voter rather than drawing it to population. The Supreme Court came back and said, no, you have to continue to draw districts based on the whole people census count population. So it's something that we stick to, and you know, we treat it like it's like come down from heaven. This is the answer.
Okay, is there an element of like the sanctuary status? Do people, they probably don't come forth and say, hey, I exist here, but it does consider that as well, correct?
Yeah, so non-citizens are counted in the census.
Right.
And there is concern that there is a significant undercount of non-citizens who don't trust the government,
Right.
who won't fill out the form, or who will fill out the form, but they can't put that 4 people live in their household because they know grandma's going to kill them if they put that she lives there.
Right.
So they'll undercount. And there's been a lot of research, particularly in California in the last redistricting, to show that, as an example, statewide, they believe, I think it was 40,000 Latino kids weren't counted. And this has real impact when you're talking about drawing down federal dollars, and it has impact when you're drawing districts. So you can think of it, if you're drawing a congressional district around Santa Ana, down in Orange County, where it's a very, very heavily Latino population, where they believe the undercount was, you know, in the tens of thousands, that congressional district now has to grow a little bit to be equal size to the others. It has to essentially dilute that population. So undercount in the census is a very real issue. There's a lot of concern about it in the 21 census, where a couple different things are coming to bear. One is increased kind of lack of trust in the government from non-citizen Latino populations and Asian populations, given the national discussion around immigration. And they're converting a lot of how the census is being done to using tablets and online things rather than humans knocking on the door.
Right.
They're taking a lot of funding out of that part, and they're going to be implementing a lot of stuff from the U.S. Census Department that hasn't been thoroughly tested. In fact, the U.S. Census Department doesn't have a permanent director right now. So there are a lot of things to suggest that the undercount will become more severe. How that impacts this districting is when we talk about areas that might have significant undercount, we would be looking at the lower income, more heavily Latino portions of the district. But again, we have to treat the number that's given to us by the U.S. Census as if it's fact. And we can't really say, well, we know that there's probably 8,000 more people here and 6,000 more people there, so we're going to adjust our district accordingly. We can't. We just have to deal with the numbers that are given to us.
All right. Thanks very much, Paul.
All right, thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. There'll be more of these meetings. Check our website, smharvard.com. Thank you.
The legend.